All right, welcome back to another episode of the Biology at Home classroom. I'm Mr. DuPont, and today we're going to be starting a new unit. We're going to be talking about plants. Okay, we've been talking about photosynthesis in the last several lessons, and so we're going to get into a more general discussion about plants in this next unit. Okay. And a good place to start with any new subject, I think, is to take a look at the historical aspect of it, the history. So we're going to start off by looking at the history of plants in terms of the evolution of plants, okay? And just my general thoughts on this. I know sometimes people have a little bit of trouble with evolution in general, or have some difficulty with grasping some of the concepts embedded in the theory. And so I sort of feel like plants are a great place to start. They are, they evolved came onto land some 470 million years ago or so. We have fossil evidence of that, and so we can look at the history of plants to get a good idea of how evolution works in general. Okay, so we're going to start with that. All right, now first of all, this diagram that I have on the ground here should be familiar to you. We had one of these back in the discussion on the chapters on evolution. Who remembers what this diagram is called? It's called a cladogram. Okay? And remember, a cladogram is simply a tool that we can use to show evolutionary relationships based on certain types of characteristics. And so we're going to use the characteristics of plants in this cladogram to kind of show how plants evolved and how evolution works in general. Okay? So, like I said, plants first evolved onto land around 470 million years ago, but before that, they were in the water. Okay? And they weren't plants yet. They were something more akin to green algae. Okay? So, all plants have a common ancestor. Okay, and so we're going to put that outgroup sort of down here at the end of our cladogram. And remember, the way the cladogram works is we're going to put some characteristics on here. We're going to put some animal groups plant groups across the top. But this line sort of represents time in a general sense. Okay, so we go all the way back to the beginning. Before there were land plants, there was the common ancestor. And so this group that we're going to put across the top, the very first group that would sort of be in the category of plants, would be our green algae. Now there's some discussion about whether or not they're technically plants and that sort of thing, but we know that all modern plants are descendants of something like green algae. We have green algae, as we'll see here in a minute, around today. But green algae are sort of the first organism that sort of that figured out photosynthesis in a sense that it led to modern plants. Okay, so when we look at our cladogram, that's our first group. Okay, now remember that what happens is along the bottom here we put certain types of characteristics. When a characteristic evolves in a group of organisms and it becomes such a benefit for that organism, that group of organisms, anything that evolves after that will possess that trait. Okay, now when we're talking about green algae are the descendants of all land plants. They lived in the water, all right, which means plants eventually had to move on to land. And so while that's not a characteristic in and of itself, I'm going to put that as our first derived character. Okay, they moved on to land. Okay, now there's a number of characteristics that had to evolve in order for them to be able to do business on land, but why did they move on to land in the first place? Well, obviously there's a much more abundance of sunlight. Sunlight's much more available on land. The deeper you go in the water, the less sunlight there is, so being on land affords you the best opportunity for sun, but it also affords you the best opportunity for carbon dioxide, one of the main ingredients in photosynthesis. Plants need carbon dioxide. It diffuses in the air much more readily than it does in the water. Okay, so plants, there were advantages to moving on to land, and characteristics had to evolve in order for them to be able to do that. But the first group of organisms that we see in terms of plants and our modern descendants would be the bryophytes, a group called the bryophytes. Okay, you know them more affectionately as mosses. And we'll look at mosses. There's other examples within that group as well, but mosses I'm going to put there, the bryophytes. They are the first group that we sort of see moving onto land. Okay, now we'll look at the bryophytes, mosses here in a second, but the next characteristic that had to evolve was one that allowed plants to get bigger. We'll look at mosses and see how small they are. They're not really all that much bigger than algae to begin with. And so how did plants begin to get bigger? Well, they had to develop certain types of what we refer to as vascular tissue. Okay? Moving on to land, it means more sunlight, it means more carbon dioxide, but you've removed yourself from the water. Plants got to have water, so they got to be able to not only get water, but move it around. Okay, and move the sugars that they make during photosynthesis around to other parts of the plants. If they're bigger, they have to be able to move it from here to there. Vascular tissue allowed them to do that. And so one of the first groups that we see, ancient groups that we still have representatives of today that we'll take a look at here, are the ferns. Okay, ferns are a group that possess vascular tissue. Okay, and then everything else, of course. So what do we have so far? We have green algae that lived in the water. Okay. Mosses that moved on to land, but do mosses have vascular tissue? No, they don't. It evolved after mosses had evolved, okay? Now, one of the other things that organisms had to overcome on land had to do with reproduction. All these organisms have to be able to reproduce in water, as we'll see, but being able to develop a mechanism for reproduction that didn't involve being in or directly around the water. This, of course, is the evolution of seeds. Okay? Seeds allow the organism being able to put your embryo in a seed and disperse it some distance away, not in the water, made reproduction a much more efficient event. And so one of the groups of organisms that we see here, these are called the gymnosperms. Okay, we'll look at some examples of these, but you know these guys as things like pine trees and cedar trees and cypress trees, okay, cone-bearing plants. We're going to take a look at some of those as well. Okay, and then how do things like pine trees reproduce? What do they produce in order to put their seeds in? They produce a cone. We refer to them as cone bearers and some other names like that, but they produce a cone. Okay. So that group, that gymnosperms, is exclusive. The next group to evolve, and the one that we see the most abundant on Earth today, are the angiosperms. Angiosperm. Okay. These are the flowering plants. I'm running out of chalk here, but these are the flowering and fruit producing plants of the world. Okay, they would enclose their seed in a fruit rather than a cone, and that of course involved the production and use of a flower in order to be able to do that. Okay, all right, now just real quickly, one of the things that we talk about with plants, one of the unique characteristics of plants involves their general life cycle. All plants, plants of course need sunlight. They all carry out photosynthesis. They're all considered to be autotrophic and multicellular. Okay, but one of the other unique characteristics of plants is that they all exhibit a life cycle that we describe as alternation of generations. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I kind of drew a quick little image of it here on the driveway for you to look at. There's better images on the internet. I encourage you to go research this further. But what it means is, when we think about animals and humans like ourselves, we spend our entire adult lives as diploid individuals, and we only reproduce haploid cells when it comes to reproduction. Okay, whereas plants, all plants will spend a portion of their life as a haploid individual, okay, and then thereby producing the mechanism, the gametes, ultimately to allow for the production of the diploid individual, okay? And so this being able to live a portion of their life as a haploid individual, remember haploid just means they only contain half of the amount of genetic material to be that organism. That seems very odd to us. we don't exist as a haploid. We only have haploid cells, our gametes, the sperm and the egg that are used in reproduction. But plants can live a portion of their life as haploid and part as diploid. And if we go back up here to our plant cladogram, we see that the general trend is that in these earlier plants that evolved, they spend most of their life as a haploid individual, very little as a diploid individual. But over time, the trend in evolution is that we get more and more of the life cycle is spent as a diploid individual. So when you look at an organism like a tree here, it's a great example of a plant. This is a diploid individual, okay? Now let's go take a look at some different examples of these plants that belong in these different groups that we've identified on our cladogram.